good morning and welcome back to this, our final panel session. And my goodness, what a great conference we've had already. We're going to be asking and answering the question, what actors, actions and tools do we need to mobilise to establish a new social, economic and environmental contract? I mean, this discussion couldn't come at a more important time. We've heard over the last 2 days a lot of really good ideas. We've heard the problems, we've heard the reality, we've heard lots of suggestions about what type of change is needed and how that change can be brought about. But what we haven't really talked about is about who needs to do what. What can we expect from the Commission? What can we expect from trade unions? What can we expect from employers? And what do commentators have to tell us about who needs to do what right now? What's our plan? So I'm going to go straight away to our first contributor in this panel. Frans Timmermans needs no introduction. He is, of course, Vice President of the European Commission. His particular brief is in relation to the just transition, the green economy, and, of course, has been an advocate voice for progressive forces in Europe. So Frans, over to you. What do you see we need to do? What can you do? A bit like, I guess, President Johnson said to Martin Luther King in relation to the civil rights that he was advocating for. I know what I'm supposed to do, but you have to make me do it. Is that where we are with the Commission? What's your thoughts on what we all need to do, and what's the Commission going to do to help us?
Well, thank you, President Johnson, for this kind introduction. Thanks a lot, Esther, and I'm really thrilled to be here. And I really want to congratulate you on organising this conference. I think it's both timely and urgent that we speak about these things because, frankly, I don't know whether humanity has ever been challenged in the way we're being challenged now. Of course, most of us live relatively comfortable lives. But if you look at the challenges that are being thrown at us, pandemic, of course, being one of them, but the climate crisis, which is looming, the ecocide, which is also looming because of biodiversity loss, the industrial revolution that, as any previous industrial revolution, can create havoc in societies, quickly shifting international relations, all these things come together. And what they do, if you put them all together, is actually challenge, if not nullify or shred, social contracts at all levels. So we need to rebuild them. We need to do this with a sense of urgency. I think this will be the defining moment for our generation. And I speak broadly. I include not just my own generation, but also millennials, Gen Zs, and everyone who has an influence on what we're collectively doing now. If we get things wrong in the next couple of years, if we don't set things on the right track in the next couple of years, I think our children and grandchildren will inherit a world that will be increasingly unlivable and increasingly a place of violent conflict. There will be wars over water if we don't really change our ways. And that's actually the basis for the European Green Deal, which made sense before the pandemic. But now that we need to recover also after the pandemic, it makes even more sense as the guiding principle of our recovery package. The European Union has been able to mobilize for the first time in its history a joint fiscal effort to fight a major recession, 1.8 trillion jointly as Europeans. 30% of this will have to be spent on climate policy, 20% on digitizing our societies, and all of it should be spent in a way that does no significant harm to our natural environment. Now, as in any other transition, and by the way, let me be very, very clear, and I think this is an important point to make, frankly, there is no choice. The choice is this: are we letting this happen, or are we shaping it? That's a choice, because it's going to happen. Looking away, hoping it's not going to happen is not a strategy. So if we want to shape this, there's actually one big principle I believe in that we should put first and foremost, and that is that we leave no one behind. And the risk of this is huge on many, many levels. The pandemic has once again taught us that whenever there's something challenging, it's always the most vulnerable that pay the highest price. And that's going to happen if we don't correct parameters in this transition as well. So at the end of the day, this era is an era where we have to redefine redistribution. Politics is always and has always been about redistribution. And now there are new factors in it. It's not just capital and labor. It's also the limited resources our planet has to offer. It's also the lack of fairness within societies and between societies. And I think these are things we need to address now. The Green Deal is part of that. And let me just quickly run through a number of elements. To set our economies and societies on the right track, we need to move now. The Commission will come up with a number of proposals, which we call the Fit for 55 plans before the summer. Why Fit for 55? If we want to make sure that we have a sustainable society, we need to be climate neutral by the middle of this century, by 2050. To get there in a reasonable way, we need to reduce our emissions as compared to 1990 with 55% 9 years from now, in 2030. And to do that, we will propose changes to the so-called emissions trading system. We will have to overhaul the regulations pertaining to energy and sustainable energy. We will have to look at energy taxation, and we will have to look at a host of legislation, CO2 emissions for cars, for instance. We will have to come up with a mechanism to correct at the border for the risk of carbon leakage to other parts of the world, or for unfair competition with other parts of the world that would not take the measures that are necessary. And all of this has to be done in such a way that we leave no one behind. This will be a just transition, or there just will be no transition. And I want to specifically focus on that because as a grandson of coal miners, I have seen in one of the most affluent and richest countries of Europe, if not the world, I have seen that if you make only a few structural mistakes, for instance, when you close a coal mining industry, you can have very long-term destructive consequences for a society. My hometown used to be one of the 1, 2, or 3 richest towns in the Netherlands. 50 years ago, the coal mines were closed. And shortly after then, until now, my hometown and 2 other surrounding towns of my hometown are always amongst the 5 poorest cities in the Netherlands. And that is because the transition wasn't just. And we have now an opportunity to do this, but also because we've mobilized so many funds, we need to use this opportunity right now. And for that, it can only happen if we have fully engaged trade unions. I see it when I talk to steel industry, the car industry, the coal mining industry. There is a lot of anxiety in the trade unions that what we're doing is leaving them behind, or not thinking about the workers, or not having real plans for skilling and reskilling workers. So we need to be very convincing and clear on this. And we can only succeed in that if at all levels, trade unions are seen as an integral part of decision-making and as an integral part of policy shaping and execution. And I spoke about this only recently with Luca Visentini again, because we've had so many contacts, especially since the campaign for the European elections and afterwards. And it is really, really necessary that we reinvigorate the role of social partners on all levels, especially also the European level. And you can count on me in being a part of that. And you can count on me to be the advocate of those who say this will be a just transition, or there just will be no transition. Thank you very much for your attention. It's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I can assure you the European Commission is at your disposal. The door of my cabinet is always open if there are things we need to discuss. I also believe that we will have to look at a development of global dimension. So I believe that talking to and involving social partners at a global scale is also necessary. We're fortunate enough to see other parts of the world now quickly joining the European effort for climate neutrality. The net zero movement is moving very quickly ahead now with the Biden administration in the US, even China committing to carbon neutrality in 2060, Japan 2050, Korea, South Korea is following that, and many more players. So we have a huge opportunity, but if we don't set the course and set the whole machine on track for the course in the next couple of years, I'm afraid our children and grandchildren will be left with huge debt, but that debt will have been spent on things that have no future. So we really need to change course, and we need to do it with you, and we need to do it now. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. That was a really setting out a great vision, and importantly, this idea that nobody gets left behind. But I'd like to push you a little bit on that question, because, as you know, the jobs that you mentioned in the sectors, the car industry or the coal industry, those jobs are good jobs. So they're jobs that have strong collective agreements. They have pensions. They provide for a family the type of life that hardworking people all aspire to. And one question is skills and being able to reskill. But the other question is, what confidence can workers and their unions have that the new jobs are going to be in sectors that recognise the right to collective bargaining, and that workers can get their fair share? Because what we see is that's a real challenge in the new industries, in the new tech sectors, in all of them. So how is the Commission thinking about that question? How are you thinking about, what can the Commission do to help workers and their unions organise and get their fair share through collective bargaining in these new sectors?
Well, first of all, I believe the Commission is under an obligation, with everything that's been said in the past, what's been said by President von der Leyen also at the hearing, to contribute to a success of the summit in Porto that will be organised, to make sure the social pillar has a meaning also in the future. I commend both the Prime Minister of Sweden and the Prime Minister of Portugal for taking this initiative. It is because we understand that if we do not provide for an opportunity to guarantee the rights of workers, why would workers embrace the idea of change? They wouldn't. Even though, that's a conundrum we're in. Even though everybody knows that the only thing you can do by stopping things is slowing down the change, not stopping the change. People will do that if they're not convinced that the new situation will provide them with the levels of protection and the levels of collective bargaining, etc., that you're used to in the present situation. So we need to make sure that when we organize that and discuss it with the different industries, that we provide for at least the same level of protection, legal protection. So we'll have to come up with legal proposals that we have now. And what we've seen in parts of the services industry forces us to be clearer about this, and also to be more forceful in terms of the content of legislation in this area. Now, in general, I'm rather optimistic about the long term, about the end situation, because for demographic reasons, every single person in Europe will be really needed to fill all the jobs that will be coming. Secondly, because I'm more and more aware of what's happening in sustainable industry, huge job opportunities, whether it's in sustainable mobility, whether it's in sustainable energy generation, whether it's in hydrogen production, whether it's in building in the building sector, because you'll see a huge renovation wave everywhere. So there is a lot of opportunity for jobs as well. But you're absolutely right. We have to prevent that these jobs become jobs that are precarious, jobs that that offer people work but no protection in work, and that's why I believe we have a collective mission to convince especially the younger generations that organizing collectively, being member of a union, has its benefits. And I hope that through the experiences of the Fridays for Future movement, young people finally understand that getting organized collectively actually does set things in motion, does make things change, does create enough counterpower against capitalism or against the power of money. And I think that's where the European Commission should be very clear and should be on the side of trade unions and of workers.
When it comes to those workers who are already feeling like they're left behind, so workers who rely, for example, on minimum wages, they're now called essential workers. Carers, cleaners, shop workers, asked every day to put their lives on the line. Can we now conclude that there's no such thing as low-skilled work in Europe, and we need to start talking about essential workers being given the respect, being paid the value that they contribute to the enterprise, to society? And what confidence do you have that the Commission's proposal for a fair minimum wage in Europe is actually going to make it? I mean, there's a lot of people who will turn up at conferences like this and say, you know, I want a just transition, nobody should be left behind. But then when it actually comes to it, we're looking around for friends to support us in this endeavour, and there's not a lot of them. So where do you see this mismatch between calling workers essential workers and then at the end of the day it translating for that worker into a wage that puts food on the family table on a Friday?
Well, I think we need to put this into legislation, very simply. I campaigned in the European election on a minimum wage across Europe. It was seen as pie in the sky, as impossible, and as just politics talking. We're going to get there. You know, why were people reluctant? Sometimes because they have bogus economic reasons, but very often because they have different systems that they think are incompatible with EU legislation, because they believe that what has been achieved in negotiations between social partners is better. I don't care how you do it. If that's a good system, we should support that and not intervene with legislation. But there are too many places in Europe where legislation will have to correct this. And you know, in those countries that were reluctant to do this and introduced it in the last couple of years, let me take Germany as an example. When the SPD came with the idea of a minimum wage, conservatives were up in arms. It would kill the economy. There would be no more hairdressers, etc., etc. And the opposite is true. The opposite is true. The minimum wage contributed to more jobs instead of threatening more jobs. So a minimum wage, especially if you look that there's still competition through wage dumping within the EU, a minimum wage is an essential element to gain the trust of people, that people in lesser paid jobs are protected as well. Secondly, why do I believe we need legislation and we need to be a bit more brutal in that, even more than we propose? And this is something I hope you can also debate. We've seen at the beginning of the pandemic, in the first wave, we've seen huge support for people in healthcare and education, in the consumer goods sector, in transport, etc. Oh my God, applause every day. I see that waning a bit. You know, people are getting used to that. And if I look at my own country now, sadly, people working in healthcare, and many of my family members work in healthcare, no longer get praise or applause, but get shouted at, get insulted because people are on edge. So you cannot just make this an emotional issue. It has to be a legal issue. And the legal issue is that people who work, I mean, one of the ravages, I think, of liberalism since the 1980s, that is undermined trust in what we see as public goods. And people working in public goods, or in the public sector, were seen as a burden on hard-working people, instead of an essential contribution to the way our societies should function. And we have an opportunity now to recalibrate that, to bring back appreciation for what we see as a public good. Health is a case in point. We talk about public health, and then we want to privatize it, which is a contradiction in terms. So I honestly believe we have this opportunity, but I'm also realistic enough to know that this is not something that will stay and can be done only on emotion. We need to put it in legal terms, and we need to make sure we start paying an honest pay to people who do these jobs. And we bloody well need to tax people who make billions just with capital without doing anything. I mean, the taxation system has become so unfair to society. Not that we are competent as the European Commission, but I have my opinion on that. We don't have competences in many areas. But if member states do not review the taxation system, the taxonomy, then we cannot make this transition to a sustainable economy. But more importantly, we cannot create the fairness that society so desperately needs. And the fact that big tech can create situations where they don't pay tax at all is completely unacceptable and should be remediated. The fact that labor is taxed so much more than capital is something you need to remediate. And you cannot endlessly say we can't do anything because it's a global business. Well, that's no excuse. It's the same excuse that was used by railway magnates in the 19th century, by petrol companies in the 19th century. It's the same thing all over. It's the same thing, as Yoga Berra would say, it's déjà vu all over again. And we need to correct that. And we have the instruments, and I think we have the public support to do it now.
My final question then to you is, when it comes to this déjà vu all over again, because I think that's a very good point that you're raising there. What's your take on the backlash? Like, is there a backlash? Is there a back? Where is it coming from? How do we counteract it? Like what do you see needs to be done? Like this we saw it with vaccination nationalism creeping up very quickly. We see a pushback against feminist values. So what is what's your understanding? Like what's your hot take on that?
Well, the problem is that now for quite some time, sadly, a big part of our society believes that the future will be less prosperous than the present. So instead of believing in progress, people believe in decline. Once you get people at a place where they believe in decline, they will want to keep what they have. If you then want to mobilize that anxiety in political terms, and if your intentions are not good, you will then mobilize that anxiety, feed the anxiety until it becomes fear, and then weaponize the fear until it becomes anger against someone you blame for this. And it's always somebody else. It's a minority, it's gay people, it's women. You need a scapegoat. Why? Because those people who weaponize people's fears have propositions that will never lead to positive results. But if they can ensure themselves against the criticism by front-loading what they do with the scapegoat they will find at the end, if it doesn't lead to anything, then they're home free. And that's what's happening all the time. That's the essence of populist politics. And there's always a measure of nationalism in it, because you can create a sense of belonging to a tribe, and the tribe is always right, and the tribe is always under threat by others. And that's the only explanation I have for the fact that sometimes, especially people to the right and the far right, are able to mobilize people who are in a difficult situation in society, to mobilize them to organize against their own interest, to safeguard the position of people with high income, or to safeguard the position of people who control the financial markets, etc. And we need to break out of this conundrum. And this is an especial challenge for progressives. Why? Because this the need for socioeconomic security is combined in the extreme right with a mobilizing of sociocultural anxiety. So there is an insecurity on both sides, socioeconomic and sociocultural, and they could sort of divert the attention from the socioeconomic insecurity by mobilizing the sociocultural insecurity, identity insecurity. And we need to break through that. And the only way you can break through that, I don't want to sound Marxist, but the only way you can break through that is to address the essential socioeconomic insecurity and to have a credible answer to that. Just by saying boo, boo to people who promote nationalism is not going to help at all. You need to solve the underlying problem, and we need to work harder at that.
I completely agree with that. Like the cancel culture is not going to work. It needs we need to have we need to demonstrate that we understand what the problems are. We need to convince people who are struggling and are fearful that we have solutions to that. But importantly, we need to be able to deliver. And Frans Timmermans, I want to thank you for being here with us and discussing exactly that question. We look forward to working with you continuously in the next couple of years. I mean, it's all to play for, exactly as you say. So much at stake, so important, the work that the Commission's doing in this. So we moving from getting the right ideas to actually seeing the delivery. And you're right, the Porto Summit is the next big moment. And we need to be able to demonstrate for that. So I'm going to move now to, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Isabel Schumann. Isabel is one of the leading Labour lawyers in Europe. She's elected as a confederal secretary here at the ETUC, a great long experience in trying to hold better regulation to account so it doesn't become deregulation. Isabel, what's our, can you set out for us the trade union vision on what our tools are, how we can use them? Over to you, Isabel.
Thank you very much, Esther. I hope you hear me well. I would like also to use this opportunity to thank for these very inspirational discussions and debate we have today. And of course, the conference has shown, if need would have been, that we are all at a crossroad, at a turning point, and that we are facing a triple crisis, and I may say a triple failure. And I just want to come back very shortly to those before giving our solutions or our way out to that. The first failure is, of course, the economic failure. And despite being anchored in the treaty, the social market economy has never really been social. And the dysfunction of capitalism due to financialization instead of sustainability, the liberalization of common goods, such as health and transport, education, the short-termism, and the support to extractive business have led to a profound and exacerbated unbalance between capital and labor, between capital and society, and between capital and the planet. And the risks are now socialized and the profit are individualized. And this is what we see indeed, again, in the current discussions and debate on the vaccines. And I just want to quote the IFT of this morning, where BioNTech, like Pfizer, are really happy to have bet on the vaccines and are saying that they will pay very comfortable dividends to their investors, whereby not taking into account that the public money that was put in research have been huge to support this development and to help the society as a whole. This is also an environmental crisis. The climate change and the ecological disaster are ticking bombs that have started to blow up. And this is due to the lack of concrete and ambitious policies. And what we also see is that there is a social crisis. In 2021, in our so developed and rich society, we face the rise of in-work poverty, child poverty, we're facing inequality, and even worse, we speak from the lost generations of youth since 2008. This leads to an even a weaker European social fabric with precariousness and poverty at the center, and where labor is becoming a commodity, and where the collective representation of workers is under attack every day. And we should not forget that poverty is a real danger for all and feeds the revival of the far right movement and the populations, which are a real danger for democracy, as we've seen latest in the US. Maria Elena André spoke about the pandemic as a wake-up call. We might also speak as the last chance to get it right, because there is no way back and because there is no alternative. So we need to seize this unique moment in history and turn a pandemic into a chance to change the paradigm. And there is an incredibly urgency to act. And the good news might be coming from Commissioner Schmid is that this might be the end of the time of Friedman approaches. So we need to be ambitious and we need to be courageous. More than a recovery, I think we need to trigger a radical transformation, a reconstruction, which needs systematic changes. We need to impact the direction of change with the people and the planet at its core, and be sure that the trade union movement is ambitious and is courageous. And what does it take? What does it take to get it right? The TUC is very much convinced and engaged already in three important avenues under one heading: democracy. And I will be very concrete here. The first point is reinforce democracy through inclusive and effective governance in decision-making processes at all relevant levels, including concerning the emergency measures to the recovery. This is about policy design processes and democratic decision processes in society, in politics, in company, where trade union and workers' representatives are key players. It is about the effective exercise of democracy with strong social and environmental component. This is where the trade union play a crucial role. The second, of course, is to reinforce democracy with the trade union movement at its core. And why? Is this not just because the workers and the trade union are those co-creating wealth and sustainability? It is because the trade union movement is the unique movement to act on the behalf of the majority of workers to provide for their protection and the defense of their interests with solidarity at the compass, to make sure that labor is not a commodity and that social justice is not a luxury. And we do not leave any workers and their family behind. This is the DNA of the trade union movement. But despite the recognitions of the trade union as a key and legitimate actors in international, European and national standards, and that the trade union rights are fundamental rights anchored in the European Treaty of the European Union and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, we face trade union bashing and trade union deconstruction of their structure by law and in practice, and this is not acceptable. May I recall that the trade unions are co-legislator at the European level and at the national level for the protection of workers to secure decent work and social justice. The economic crisis, the twin transitions and the pandemic call for more collective bargaining, call for more regulations, as Frans Timmermans just said, and they call for new rights to design a robust economic, social and ecological contract. And this is the reasons why the ETUC is calling for a social progress protocol to guarantee the overarching and transversal application of fundamental social rights, and that social rights take the precedence over economic freedom and competition role in case of conflict. We call for new rights. I think we need to promote the youth guarantee. We need to fix the gender pay gap. We need minimum wage. We need a regulation on artificial intelligence at the workplace, on telework, on the right to disconnect, to shape digitalization that delivers for all and not abuse data privacy and exacerbate surveillance and unsustainable automation. just to name a few initiatives that are at stake. Better regulation agenda is ill-equipped, very ill-equipped to address those challenges, as it is centered on administration and regulatory burden reduction, costs, short-termism, whereby it should be focusing on the quality of legislation, on long-term investment, on mainstreaming human rights and fundamental rights and the value of the European Union. We organize and we build long-standing alliances and partnership for common purposes with society, with NGOs. And this is something that Laurent Berger has mentioned in his introduction. And I think there is a very, very promising initiative on the human rights due diligence and responsible business conduct. The ETUC and the NGOs fight for a mandatory initiative from the Commission. And we're fighting since a long time with the NGOs on that demand. And we have very concrete examples of the delivery for those joint purposes. We have created a joint initiative to reply to the open public consultation of the Commission. And we have gathered so far 21,000 replies. And I think this is to show that we have common objectives and we have common goals that we can pursue together. And I invite you to join. And my last point is that we reinforce democracy at work. Next to the strong democratization of the economy, we need strong democratization of business in the European Union to shape anticipation of change in a sustainable manner, where the voice of workers play a key role in decision-making processes to secure decent work, job quality, and to maintain employment. This is the reasons why the ETUC demands for a new framework on information, consultation, and board-level employee representation, and the revision of the European Works Council Directive. And may I conclude in recalling the essential function of collective bargaining and workers' participation. It is social cohesion, it's social peace, and this is to prevent the crisis. And it will be a fair transition with the trade union, or there will be no fair transition. And the last word I would say is that the promotion of collective bargaining is the joint responsibility of social partners and states. The exercise of collective bargaining is the joint responsibility of social partners. And we need to be two to tango. I'm very much looking forward to the discussions and the next presentation, and I hand over back to you, Esther.
Thanks so much, Isabel, and we'll do exactly that. We're going to take the next intervention now from Therese. Therese is the Deputy Director of, the Deputy General Secretary of it's the Deputy Director General, Therese. I'm so sorry. I mean, I know you well. I'm just trying to get that right. It's just the stress of all this that's going on in here for me. So it's great to see you and great to hear from you. Therese is our social partner. I've discussed with Therese and negotiated with Therese on a lot of issues. And so one of the key leadership voices within Business Europe about the importance of social dialogue and about solving the tough issues between ourselves. So, Therese, great to have you here, and over to you.
Good morning, Esther. Good morning, Executive Vice President. Good morning, John, Isabel, and good morning to all participants. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning for a very important debate and at a very crucial time. I think all the previous speakers have alluded to it, and I have no doubt that you have discussed it at length in all the previous sessions of your conference. What I would like to do with you in this session is first of all share a few thoughts about content, and then share a few thoughts about the issue of this new economic, social and environmental contract, which is to be debated in this session more particularly. When it comes to content, I think it's absolutely undoubtable that we are facing an unprecedented unprecedented challenges. Never in history, as the Vice President has said it, we have been faced with so many challenges, and we absolutely have to find credible, efficient solutions in order to meet these challenges. But what I have perhaps lacked so far, and maybe you discussed it earlier on, is enough attention to the growth agenda. Because at the end of the day, you will not be able to build a fair and a sustainable Europe if you do not have the means to invest in that. And at the start of this this institutional cycle, Business Europe has worked and proposed an agenda for the European Union, which is a three-pillar agenda. We called it Prosperity, People and Planet. And we have put it in that order, not because we think that prosperity is an end in itself, but because we really think that this is the basis in order and a prerequisite in order to be able to invest in our social systems and in the protection of the environment. This three-pillar agenda is, of course, more relevant than ever. But at the same time, we have to factor in the new challenges that are facing us due to the unprecedented crisis due to COVID. Yes, it has been a long time that people were talking about having to prepare for possible pandemics, but the fact is, and we were probably not sufficiently well prepared, and the social and economic suffering that we are seeing now is partly the result of that. But the truth is that even if we had been prepared, you still need to be prepared for the right type of virus, and there are many elements of uncertainty there, so everything cannot be predicted and controlled, so you have to be prepared, and you can be prepared to a certain extent for the unexpected, but you can never be prepared for everything. So, and the better and the stronger your economy is, and the more agile your economy is, the better you are then able to react quickly and swiftly to the unexpected. So that's a first element which I wanted to bring on the table for the discussion today. Second element which I wanted to stress, and I've already alluded to it, is that we need more than ever a growth strategy at the European level. And of course, this strategy includes the green transition, but it cannot be limited to the green transition. And I want to be absolutely clear. Business Europe supports the Green Deal, and we support climate neutrality. And companies are making huge efforts to cut their emissions and will continue to do so. The investment needs are huge, and the recovery plan is, of course, a good start and a good help, but it cannot do the trick alone. We also need to focus much more on how to make sure the unprecedented resources that have just been made available thanks to this European Recovery Plan are used efficiently and are actually bringing about the results that they want to bring about. And I think on that, we need to focus much more. For that, we need to focus not only on the financial dimension, but also on the non-financial dimension of this recovery plan. And there are four things in particular that I would like to highlight in these respects. As part of the non-financial elements that are crucial to make a success of the European Recovery Plan, there are four things. First, we must ensure that the legal framework does not undermine growth prospects, because at the end of the day, it is this future growth that will allow to pay back the money that is borrowed, the debt that is issued, and it's also this which will allow to generate future investments. Second thing that we must do is to ensure that policies implemented under the Green Deal, but all the other EU policies as well, facilitate employment creation. Otherwise, people will turn against those policies in the end, and they will end up being worse off than before. Third element, we must pay much more attention to the details of policy measures proposed. And I would like to emphasize that we should be able to have rational debates on this, and it should be possible to question some elements of the Green Deal or of other policies pursued at EU level, or some components of legislative proposals without being automatically dismissed as irrelevant or as having bad intentions, bad hidden intentions to undermine the whole project. I think we need to overcome this phase, and we need to come to a much more nuanced debate. Let me give you a very concrete example. In the debate on the taxonomy for sustainability finance, we can be in favor of, and we are in favor of the idea of having such an EU taxonomy. But at the same time, to make progress, we are saying it very clearly. We must not enter and apply this taxonomy or shape this taxonomy in a way that will oppose artificially green and brown activities. And the aim that we should pursue with this taxonomy should be to finance the greening of the economy as a whole, including using transition technologies, and not putting the anathema on some perfectly useful technologies. This leads me now to the last part of my remarks, which is how can we establish a new social, economic, and environmental contract. And the first element I would like to say, and this links with what I've just said, is that to establish such a contract, we need to be able to have the conditions for a rational debate. So what is this contract exactly in our view, in Business Europe's view? I think we see this contract as a process that will allow policymakers, business and employers organizations, trade unions, and all the other relevant stakeholders, as well as individual companies, individual workers, individual citizens, to join forces in order to deliver an economic, social, and environmental goals that the EU has set itself and that Business Europe fully supports. So this is how we see it. We see it as a process rather than as a paper with signature. And each of the actors I have just mentioned would then contribute in a way that reflects their own role and responsibilities in society. There will be, of course, a variety of tools, and each tool will have to be chosen depending on the content of what you are trying to achieve. But let me give you a few examples. First example, and this is absolutely crucial to have if we want to have growth, we need to have a modern industrial strategy developed at EU level, but also, of course, developed across Europe in all the member states with a fine articulation between the different levels of actions. Second example, we need smart legislation, because the issue is not whether or not to have legislation, but the issue is when we have legislation, it has to be smart. And for that, it's very important that it is drafted by public authorities in consultation with the stakeholders concerned and with social partners in particular. Third example of tool, smart collective agreements concluded by the social partners where this makes sense. And when I say where this makes sense, what I mean is at the level where it makes sense, and also with a content that makes sense and that will allow to reconcile the goals of economic, social, and environmental progress. Other examples, there can also be very concrete projects taken by individual companies, individual citizens, or civil society organization. So all this it means that what matters at the end of the day is the actions that we are taking. And in order to help mobilize all actors so that they join forces, it's very important to create the conditions for a positive debate. Mobilization is important, but being mobilized against is not enough. What we need to find, if we want to have a new contract, is to find better ways to be mobilized all together for positive goals, for positive actions, for finding solutions in order to meet our economic, social, and environmental goals. These are the few ideas I wanted to put on the table in the context of this roundtable. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Therese. We're going to move now to our third and last panellist this morning, who is John Elkington. John is an entrepreneur, an author, and we're famously writing on the triple bottom line of the social, the ecological, and the financial. So, John, you're very welcome. Over to you.
Esther, immense thanks. And I just wanted to say thank you to Isabel and Therese and France for setting up the issues here, the challenges, and also I think the opportunities as well. I'm going to try and step back just slightly. We've been talking very much about the contract side of all of this. And what I'm going to do is talk about something else that was a term that was actually in the this conference's setup literature, which was about paradigm. And I've read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, back when I was 14. Probably it had the biggest impact on me of any book that I've ever read. And we all know that there are these moments where they're fairly rare, but where everything changes. And we've heard from each of our three panelists to date that this is an extraordinary time. And I'm trying to look at the architecture of why it is such an extraordinary time, and why simply having new contracts will not, I think, address the problems that we collectively now face. So we've heard a lot in the last 2 or 3 years that capitalism is now due for reinvention, a reset, all sorts of languages being used. And a moment ago, Milton Friedman was mentioned. No question that his 50-year stranglehold, in a way, on business thinking and the thinking of people in the financial markets and so on is weakening. It's certainly not yet completely relaxed. But a couple of years ago, we've heard from Isabel about the sort of prosperity and people and planet formulation, and that's fantastic. But 25 years ago, in 1994, I came up with the notion of the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. I put people in front for a very particular reason, even though I thought planet was eventually going to be at least, if not more important. And the cartoon here was done by a Financial Times cartoonist, Ingram Pin, back in 1991 for me. And it gave the sense that we needed in top level deliberations in every sector of our societies and economies, a voice for nature, a voice for the social issues, poverty, but many other issues, and then a voice for the longer term future. And the idea of the robot was simply that robots at some stage might be invited around boardroom tables. The actuality has actually overtaken, some of you will know that in 2014, the first expert system was appointed to a board actually in Hong Kong, and expert systems are now being developed that will represent complex agendas at board level. And I 2 years ago, I withdrew the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit, through Harvard Business Review. And I'm just going to say a little bit about why and where I think we're headed next. So most people listening to this event will have read the work at some stage, or read reviews of the work of Nassim Nicholas Taleb. They'll know his book, The Black Swan, that came out in 2007, just ahead of the financial crash. And they will also know that he talked about black swans being outliers. They come out of the blue, complete surprise, extreme off the scale impact. And very often after the event, we try and work out what's just happened to us, and we get it wrong. So we set ourselves up to fail again. And he's been asked innumerable times whether COVID-19 is a black swan. And he said, absolutely not. It's something that we saw coming, we chose to ignore. We're doing exactly the same thing now with climate change very often. So the question I asked myself last year was, if black swans largely take us where we don't want to go and do so exponentially, what would it be like if we could move exponentially in directions that we did want to go? So I did this book, came out in April of last year. And the The subtitle, The Boom in Regenerative Capitalism, may well have looked a bit weird to some people, but it's interesting. September of last year, a company that the trade union movement really doesn't like, and I think for very good reason, Walmart, their CEO, shown here, Doug McMillan, went public saying that Walmart was going to be a regenerative business, a regenerative company. Now, I think he's thinking about that in terms of environment, which is good, thank you. It's also in terms of the financial and economic side of the business, but I wonder how much of that's going to be on the social side. So we've got these voices coming through, starting quite powerfully using new language. And the question is, what do they actually mean and what are they actually going to deliver? And when I'm asked about green swans, examples, I tend to say these are profound market shifts. I'm not going to read the bullet points, but they're multidimensional. And I think the EU Green Deal that Frans Timmermans has so energetically championed is at least potentially an early example of that. It happens to be a huge one, 1.82 trillion euros or whatever. But I think it's something that I'm excited about, and I hope we will see a lot of interesting outcomes from. Another green swan is, we've heard a moment ago about the school climate strikers, Greta and so on. And you know, I've been on some of those marches. I love the spirit of these younger people, but there are people inside the business, and that can be on trade union side, it can be on, you know, in the corporate world formally. But one of the things that we did over the last year is work with a Spanish renewable energy and infrastructure company, Acciona, bringing 27 of their youngest people from around the world into a process. And it started off looking at a 5-year strategy for sustainability. And at the end of the process, with the demand from the top team, it became a 10-year strategy for the company, for the business as a whole. And I think we're at a point now where we've really got to bring younger people in and engage them in deciding their future in many ways. A couple of final slides. The paradigm is shifting. 10 years ago, some of you may remember, the front cover of The Economist looked like this image on the left. And basically, we were being told that for the first time in the history of this planet, a single species, our own, was dictating much of what was happening around our Earth. And it's now described as the Anthropocene. And for me, that is the paradigm shift that is now in the process of impacting us all. We're not ready for it. We're not set up in terms of coping or governing the sort of processes that are in play here. And just on the right there, working with a range of different companies and working with a regulatory body, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, we've been looking at 3 horizons. Now, you'll notice there's no time scale at the bottom. This could be 70 years, it could be 20 years or whatever. It depends on the organization. But our sense is, and this sense is a compound outcome of the work with a range of different organizations, is that we're moving out of an era that was defined by responsibility. Everyone should be transparent, accountable, engage their stakeholders, all of that good stuff. That doesn't go away, but that's become table stakes. That's become a minimum requirement. And the responsibility agenda continues to expand. I mean, it's wealth divides, it's access to public health care, it's tax evasion, these sorts of things. But the problem is everything that we've done on the responsibility front has not warded off the system crisis that we now face. So we have a resilience problem, and it's at every level in our societies, every level in our economies. And the only way longer term that you can regenerate declining systems is to invest in them, to regenerate them. And that's why I think, you know, the fact that people like Walmart are now starting to use the regeneration language is important. We should be excited if they deliver, but we should actually track very carefully what they mean by regeneration. Final slide. I think there's no question that we're surrounded by a huge number of black clouds. This is an incredibly taxing time for everyone, and particularly for people, you know, in marginal employment, younger people sort of shaken out of education, all these sorts of things. But historically, in moments like these, this is where our societies tend, not all of them, but some of them, to step up in very different ways and invent the future. Now, I'm not going to say thank you to COVID-19 anytime soon, but for the first time in my working life, we have seen a period that would normally have seen the triple bottom line or the sustainability, or whatever we call it, agenda scraped off the table. It's come through even more forcefully. And I think that's both exciting, but it's a challenge to us all to step up and make sure that the agenda that is properly addressed now is the one that we need the world to engage. So I'll hand back to you, Esther, at that point. Thank you.
John, thank you so much for that. We've been looking at the questions that have been put to us from the participants here today, and so I'm going to put this question to all three of you. It's a question it's from Paul, and his question relates to, is there a role for the state as the employer of last resort? So a job guarantee. What's your thoughts on the role of the state in terms of providing employment, in terms of guaranteed jobs? And then the second question from Matthew relates to alliances. But let's start with this first one. The role of the state. Undoubtedly, in COVID, it's demonstrated the value and importance of the state being available to take quick action. It's also demonstrated the importance of the European Union in coordinating the actions of the state. A very strong financial initiative coming forward under SURE to make, to support the short-term jobs. But this question, certainly a lot of millennials asking it. What is the role of the state as an employer of last resort? Let's work backwards. We'll go John, Therese, Isabel. So John, you first.
Well, the first thing to say is that business leaders for quite a long time, decades, have been saying we need to get government out of the way because it gets in the way. And now what I'm starting to hear among the companies that we interact with and work with is a very different message evolving. And it is, we need more government, but we don't need government as usual. We need, there's a wonderful social enterprise in my own city of London called Apolitical, and what they do is they track best practice in government and in the public sector, and they spread it across to other public servants. And I think government, needs to be upgraded. It's not currently, many parts of it may be, but it has a problem. It's not fit for purpose in what's coming. So yes, probably as an employer of last resort, all of these good things. But fundamentally, government almost needs to go through the processes that the business has been forced to go through over the last 15 to 20 years.
Therese?
Yes, thank you, Esther. I think you've alluded to it when you introduced this question. I think the situation and what we have seen in the last year clearly shows that there is a role for the state as protector of last resort, and I wouldn't necessarily limit this to the question of job guarantee, even so it's a very important question in today's circumstances. But we also have to remember that the state in this case has stepped in because of a very peculiar situation. For the first time ever in history, we are in a situation where you have perfectly functional and working and profitable companies that have to close down by public authorities' orders for public health reasons. Nobody's contesting the fact that if this is what is required in order to address a very serious health situation, so it has to be done. But it is a very unusual and atypical situation and unprecedented. So in that context, it is normal that the government, the state, steps in as job guarantor, because he's actually, at least temporarily, theoretically destroying millions and millions of jobs because of these closures. So the only way not to have an actual real destruction of this job is to step in with the temporary unemployment schemes, with support to companies who have to close down, etc., in order to make sure that when we come to a situation where we have solved the health crisis, there is still an economic and social fabric which is there to pick up and to refunction very quickly. But should that become the new normal? Certainly not. And I think there again, when we talk of the role of the state, we have to enter into the nuance and say, yes, the role of the state undoubtedly has a role for protecting citizens in various ways, including by stepping in as it has today. But at the same time, I would not see it as an appropriate way of functioning if the role of the state evolved into becoming a permanent job guarantor, even for activities which are bound to disappear because of the evolution of the economy and society and the way in which we are producing and working. So I think here we have to look at the nuances.
Isabel.
Thank you, Esther. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think the state is not destroying jobs. The state is saving life in the current situations we are in. And I think this is one of the very importance of recognitions of the failure to have liberalized public sectors, which are essential for society, which are health, amongst others. So I think here I would really see a real need to for the public sector and the state to regain control on essential services, and health being one of them. Transport is another one. Mobility, I think, is one of the other elements we have to take on board. And I think it's very important to see that the state is also very much able to adapt to the new technology, to adapt to innovations, to adapt to the future. And this is something that not just business can do and cannot just business drive. And I think what we need is at the state regain the possibility to control research and to lead research for the good of all as a common good, and not for the interest of certain. And here again, I come back to the FT of this morning. Pfizer and BioNTech are very proud of making huge profit and on the issue of the vaccine. I think this is something that, sorry, it's not moral, it's not ethical. And I think we have, in such a pandemic, we have all the responsibility to carry, and the responsibility of business is also to deliver for society.
It's a really good point, Isabel. What I would say is that this great myth that private sector can do things so much better than the state was pretty much blown out of the water when it came to COVID. You know, that the say reduction in the infrastructure or the need to step up and provide care, or the money for the research, or the distribution of the vaccines, or the, you know, like, so I think in particular, because I've been looking at the questions, like people are really questioning the paradigm that we're operating under, which is that the private sector can do everything more efficiently and better, and the state does everything, I would say, badly and inefficiently. And it's quite clear that the balance of that got too much into the private sector rather than the public sector, and there's an awful lot that needs to be done in our society. So it's not that there's a lack of work, and there's not that there's a lack of things that need to be done. What there is, though, is if you like, a gap between the recognition of that and then the availability of resources to the public sector to be able to deliver those. And I guess, you know, one of the other questions then that people are asking, which is about windfall profits that were made by some enterprises during COVID, and I'm not sure, Therese, I saw you were looking for the floor. Like, what's your thoughts about in what way is the business community leading the discussion on this question about fair shares, paying our fair shares, about recognizing that, like what's your thoughts about that? So if I go Therese, Isabel, John this time, please. So Therese, over to you.
Sorry. I think we again here we have to look at the nuances, because some of the examples that were given, I really don't think that if we were going to institute as the new norm a system where the state would do absolutely everything, it's a question of finding the smart ways of where the state should intervene and how, and not a simplistic dichotomy saying all of what the state is doing is perfect and all of what companies are doing is bad, or vice versa. I think this is simply the wrong approach. Allusions have been made to the vaccines. Let's not forget, if there was not private research and private operators, you would not have had these vaccines. Of course, they had support and financial support from the public authorities, but there are a few countries where it is a much more state-managed research policy that is existing, and those are not the countries where the vaccines were found. So we have also, again, to look at the reality and the nuances there in order to see that it's about finding the right synergies between companies, the states, the workers, the trade union movement, the other stakeholders, so that everybody brings its share and helps to advance and to make progress and to tackle the challenges that we are facing. It's not about opposing people or categories of players in simplistic dichotomies.
Isabel.
Yeah, I don't think there is any simplistic approach to these situations, but I think there is a clear need for accountability and responsibility for the society, and how the situations of a pandemic has to be taken on board. I do think that there is a need for the rehabilitation of the public sectors, and it's particular for the essential services that the public sectors provides. And I think there is also the possibility for this public sector to drive the innovations and to drive the changes, the drastic changes we need. And I think there is a real good element or good initiative that should be taken on board by the Commission, is looking at the conditionalities and the access to public money. And I think it's here where I think the commons goods come in questions. If we understand, and this is not the idea that the state is taking over everything, and we do understand the need for public-private partnerships in certain elements, but I think we have to drive these private partnership in the right directions. And I think this is one of the main messages that take away of this conference, is that we have to change the directions, and we have to make sure that these directions serves and delivers for the people and the planet. And I think this is where these positive conditionalities towards greener investment, towards greener productions, towards social acceptable productions, where trade unions, workers, collective bargaining are at the basis of the social contract. And I think public procurement should be the place where indeed access to public money should be linked to collective bargaining, should be linked to decent work, should be linked to minimum wage. So I think here there is an issue to be looked at.
John.
Well, to the question, I think windfall profits need to be taxed if the tax systems are going to remain politically acceptable, legitimate, and so on. So I agree with what Therese and Isabel have both said, but I think the tax system across Europe is dysfunctional in many different ways. And in my own country, which is dysfunctional in its own ways, we're talking now about a carbon tax at every level in the economy. And I think that's the sort of experimentation increasingly we need to see. But there's one thing that Franz Timmermans said, something that really rattles around my brain and bears on this question to an extent, which is, he said there are going to be huge numbers of new jobs. Now, longer term, that's true. But if anyone among you have looked at the work of Rethink X, based both in the UK and Silicon Valley, and they've done 3 sector studies. One is on transportation and mobility, one is on energy, that's the most recent one, and the middle one is on cattle ranching and dairying in the United States. And all 3 of those studies make the same point, which is that the new technologies that are coming through, and which everyone's getting terribly excited about, and for good or bad reasons, all of them destroy jobs. And they destroy jobs at a very considerable scale. And so when I'm thinking about governments, I think they really need to get their brains around this. They need to think about not just sort of local reskilling, but reskilling us all in order to prepare us for what comes next. That needs to be paid for. Therefore, we need a legitimate, healthy, effective tax system. So yes, in the short term, let's go after some of those windfall profits, but let's think about the bigger picture at the same time.
We're getting quite a lot of questions in relating to alliances, like what are the alliances and coalitions that we can build, from the we say the Fridays for Future to traditional trade union collective action, or so specifically with the climate change movement, but also with other movements looking for social change. If we start this time with Isabel. And then we go John to raise. Is that fair? What's our opportunities for alliances, Isabel?
I think we have a lot of opportunities. You mentioned the Friday for Future, and here the ETUC has been in touch with this movement. Of course, at the very beginning, Ludovic met Greta, and it was very enriching discussions there. We have put in place, as I mentioned, an initiative with NGOs, which are covering not just the social, not just the environmental dimension, both of them. And I would add to that issue of fighting against corruption, fighting against fiscal dumping, focusing on the issue of human rights, due diligence, and responsible business conduct, because we think there is here a momentum that we have to follow, and there is a need to act. And we do believe that the European Commission can make the difference with a legal proposal. So, of course, we have to respect our specificities, and that was the clear message of Laurent Berger. We can contribute to the debate with all the specificities we have, but the European Trade Union movement has embraced that. I mentioned the ecological dimension, likewise the necessity to fight against corruptions and social dumping and fiscal dumping quite broadly. And I think on the issue of taxations, we are all on board, of course, with what has been said. So, of course, respecting those specificities, one dimension, but joining forces also with the civil society communities and groups that are fighting for the same purposes, then I think here we have a real chance. And this is what we have done in terms of human rights, due diligence, and responsible business conduct. And this is also alliances we'll build with other NGOs and other groups in the future, I'm sure, on those dimensions.
So Esther, if I could pick up, I'm going to ask a question. I have great respect for the deep history of the trade union movement. I think people were immensely courageous, particularly in the early days when they were fighting entrenched power. I think Isabel's exactly right that social dumping and corruption, these sorts of issues, human rights, they do need to be addressed. Unfortunately, the main instrument that the deep trade union movement has sort of bequeathed, collective bargaining, is a pretty blunt one. It is not proactive. It doesn't seem to engage with the deep future. So in a sense, I think the trade union movement, if it's going to be acceptable to the Gretas of this world, the next generation, has to break frame. It has to do things that people do not expect unions to do. And the question is, can the union movement use, for example, collective bargaining in the interest of future generations? Has that been done? I don't know whether you've done that. I don't know whether the union movement has done that. But if you have done, or if you're thinking about it, I think that would actually be quite helpful, because it would actually identify the unions as a strategic, creative partner, not just a self-interested bunch of people trying to cling on to what was. Forgive the attempt at honesty, but that's the way I see the world.
Yeah, it's a good push back to us, because all too often trade unions are represented exactly in that way, particularly in the media, that we're only about protecting the interests of a few insiders, and that we don't have a vision of the future. In fact, I was watching Deep Space Nine. I'm a bit of a science fiction fan, and they said there's a union on planet, I can't remember the name of the planet, but there was a union there. And I said, oh, this is great. In the imagined future, unions will have a role. But what was the planet? It was a mining planet. So even in the imagined future, the role for the unions was put back, we'll say, to the tradition of the past. And that's one of the main challenges, actually, that the trade union movement is facing at the moment, is this, we'll say, framing of us as, we'll say, something of the past, as a few insiders trying to protect dying industries. And nothing could be farther from the truth. The trade union movement is predominantly, particularly in Europe, it's majority of women. And then the trade union movement is, sorry, I keep getting feedback in my ear when I'm talking. And not only is it predominantly women, it's also very forward-looking. Also, there are lots of examples. I'm going to hand over to Isabel now, but there are lots of examples of the sunset industries, the union movement being at the forefront of the solutions that are needed to move dirty industries to clean industries. We're at the leading edge of that discussion. So we concluded at EU level an agreement with the employers earlier this year for a blueprint for negotiating change. The Digitalization Agreement is an agreement that sets out how companies can successfully manage the transition to a digital future that is green, clean, and respects human rights, because there's a danger that everything in the future is presumed to be, good, and that also is a challenge that's being faced up to by the trade union movement. So, for example, in that digitalization agreement, we looked at everything from guaranteeing that workers would have the ability to change their jobs and occupations, get a chance of reskilling, who would pay for the reskilling of the workers, but also things like the human in control principle. Because one of the more frightening aspects of the future is that, and certainly I've been out in Silicon Valley, I've met some of those tech leaders there, and their vision of the future is that humans become a bit like widgets in the machine. So what we need to make very clear is that the human must always be able to turn it off. Like, the worker must be in control of the machine. Can't have a situation develop where the machine is in control of the worker. And so if you like, that agreement concluded at EU level through social dialogue on behalf of ourselves and the employers is a blueprint and groundbreaking for that. So it's quite wrong to think about collective bargaining only being for a small restricted group of people in those particular sectors. I think the challenge we have, though, is that we're ready and available and want to come to the table with solutions and ideas. The struggle we have is the resistance to having us there, and the lack of openness. And it's not just employers that experience, or workers that experience that. We see in the East, employers experience a lot of that too, that there is a tendency of governments to think that they know best. On these questions, you only get to good outcomes and good solutions if you have everybody around the table. Like the only way you can solve tricky, complicated, intricate problems like this is to have us around the table. But Isabel, do you want to give John some of the examples? So over to you.
So just to complement, I think we are not easy and comfortable partner to discuss with, and I think this is one of the elements that our detractors, so to say, try to use not to join the table, the negotiation table with us. The other parties, clearly, of course, I mentioned that in my interventions, there is recurrent daily attempt to take away what trade unions have succeeded to put in place, being in collective agreements, being in legislations. And there is also this attempt, sometimes successful, like in France, to deconstruct trade union structure to represent workers. So I think here we are clearly attacked, and I think this is potentially because we are not so easy and because we point exactly where the problems are and how they have to resolve. And just to give you good examples, because we have a lot of them, Esther mentioned collective bargaining. I could mention workers' participation at the workplace. We have evidence over evidence that shows that with workers' representative at the Works Council's level, at the European Works Council's level, with co-determinations, business are doing much better. And they've done much better during the 2008 crisis, and they recovered much quicker than other businesses after the crisis. We have evidence that we have gathered during this pandemic from the very outset that where the changes were triggered, that was on the basis of collective bargaining at the workplace to secure protective equipment, to secure that workers could go on telework with the necessary support, not just on their own PC at the kitchen table. And I think this is where health and safety matters. This is where intrusive artificial intelligence have to be stopped. And likewise, we have in terms of the social distancing and tracking of people, we have to be very, very cautious and very aware that there is here also this additional element of undue surveillance that take place. And I think this is the reasons why on the top of collective bargaining, where we can, and for the moment, there is a real tendency to stop us to do that or to prevent us to do that. We need to have the recourse and the complementary recourse of regulation.
Can I just say thank you to you both for those answers? Those were very helpful. If somebody could circulate the link to that agreement, that would be enormously helpful.
Yeah. And Business Europe could easily do the link because it's our joint agreement, but I certainly will make sure before this session ends that there's a link in there to our digitalization agreement. Just want to say on that, like one of the most powerful examples of the joined up between the Fridays for Future was a German, I'm pretty sure it was German, the protecting of a public transport, and there was a strike by the workers, and the Friday for Future came out together, and that just struck me as exactly what we need to get to, because there's this idea of divide and conquer. It's like the oldest idea in the book, but it's the most effective idea in the book. So you see it being done between men and women workers, between workers in the East and West, between people who have jobs and people who don't have jobs. And now we're beginning to see it between workers, you know, that there's an attempt to divide us. There's an attempt to drive a wedge between people who are, you know, campaigning for the health of the planet and people who are campaigning for the health of the worker. You know, so and that we can't let that happen to us. That social justice, exactly as you were saying in your book, John, this triple bottom line, you know, that we can't have it. We can't allow a situation to happen where we're being divided and put against each other. Or you've got some quite questionable efforts. I don't know much about the Walmart example, but I do know that we have to be vigilant about greenwashing, and that companies say, "Look how wonderful I am! I'm, you know, taking care of the green," and at the same time not properly paying people for their work and giving them respect and dignity at work. But Therese, you have been quiet for a while now, so it might be helpful if you could give your vision of how social dialogue, you know, both sides coming together is the most effective, we say, way of coming up with these solutions. You know, how do we move forward on that? So Therese, over to you.
Thank you, Esther. Yes, I think that social dialogue has undoubtedly a crucial role to play. You have explained and referred to the agreement that we have concluded on digitalization, but there are many other examples. We are currently also discussing and working with you on the circular economy, where we are looking at very concrete examples in the ground, supported by experts, and in view of, through that work, preparing for a discussion on what could be joint recommendations by the trade unions and Business Europe and the other social partners on those issues. So there is undoubtedly a privileged role, I would say, to social partnership in this. At the same time, I think it's also important that if we want this social partnership role to flourish in a context where, let's face it, the collective defense of interest, the way to do it is changing because of very, very profound changes in society, especially in the Western world. We need to also make sure that there is breathing space for the collective solutions to be devised by the social partner jointly to be able to be done, to be carried out. And we have also, on both sides, to resist the temptation, and the temptation can exist on both sides, to hide between public authorities and wait for them to deliver what in effect we should deliver jointly together through negotiations for our own members. And I think that is an element that we need to keep in mind if we want to be successful in the long term, because we are not living in a period where the collective defense of interest is easy. We are living in a period when it's really profoundly changing. So we must, whenever we have an opportunity to do something positive together, we must seize it and resist the temptation to hide behind what other people could deliver for us without taking risks.
I want to ask one last question, and then I'll ask everybody to do a wrap up. So there's one last question, a round of the last question, and then we'll ask everybody to do a final 2 minutes. Just what do you think? So my last question to everybody is like, what do you think the key lesson and lasting legacy of COVID is going to be? Like, what is it? So, John, will we go to you first? Like what do you think the legacy, the lesson is?
Well, it's the most difficult question yet, isn't it? Because we don't properly know. But my sense is, and I touched on it a moment ago when I said, for the first time ever in my working career, a period where you would have thought that the system change agenda would have been pushed sideways, it's actually come through even more forcefully. And I think what that has actually demonstrated to people in positions of influence and power, but just the general public, is that many of the issues that we're now facing are systemic. And you can't deal with systemic crises by incremental solutions, just doing percentage points of improvement year on year. And that's where I think Therese, and what you were saying in terms of business and the financial markets and the trade unions and civil society now need to properly understand what collectively we need to see happen in our world, and work out where we can jointly work in push in those sorts of directions. I think the period where we can sort of delegate, subcontract our sort of activism to trade unions and to NGOs. I love them all, but we've all got to step up now. We've all got to understand that this is one of those make or break moments in our history where either we get this right together or it really isn't going to work at all, would be my view.
Isabel.
Yeah, I think this is what the trade unions have identified since a long time. I think the 2008 crisis has already shown the way out, and we've learned the lessons, and we are on the offensive from the day one, I would say, when it comes to the management of the crisis and the protection of workers and their families. I think this is something that we cannot reduce the trade unions to the workers. I think we do care for their jobs, to maintain their employment, but also to make sure that they have the necessary securities and guarantees to have a decent living. So I think this is, we care for the people, and we care for the people on this planet. And I think this is also something that the trade unions have taken on board quite a long time ago. And I think this is also where we see not just us as the driving seat, but as you've mentioned, John, I think this is a collective responsibility. And we are clearly here not hiding any behind anyone. We are clearly showing that we have there is a need for actions, and we are part of the solution. We are part of the solution to get out of the crisis. But one issue is really sure: we can't go back to business as usual. And I think this is clearly what is the takeaway of these discussions over the last 3 days. This is not an alternative. We have to shape a new future, which is much more sustainable and much quicker than what we had planned so far. And we are here. We are part of the solutions, and we are on the offensive to provide what workers and their family and the planet needs.
Therese, what's the lasting legacy?
I'm always very
from your point of view?
I think I will be very prudent, because first of all, we are not yet out of this crisis. So it's maybe a bit premature to try and draw very, very firm lessons from it. But I would say that if I look at what has happened so far, what strikes me is that in reality, those countries which were best able to cope with the situation and to alleviate the negative effects of the crisis were countries where you had, first of all, a strong economic base with a strong industry. It strikes me very much that the countries where you had a strong industrial base are actually better able to shoulder the economic and social consequences of this crisis. Doesn't mean, and the second thing I would like to highlight as a lesson is probably the other lesson is that, yes, there will be huge adaptations, because as people have said, business as usual is not an option. But I think we have to also avoid falling into the trap of throwing the baby with the bathwater. There are many strong elements on which we can build and that we need to keep. So it's about transforming Europe so that it comes stronger out of this crisis, but building and keeping all the positive strengths that we have, because we tend to forget this in time of crisis. But still, if you compare with other regions of the world, our European economic and social model is one of the best performing ones.
Then I suppose we need to do a wrap up on the question we were asked, because we've had a very interesting conversation that's gone off in different points, and I can only blame the chair, be myself, for doing that. But I wanted to follow the avenues and the questions we were getting online. I mean, what we were asked to look at is that what's the gap between all of the ambition? Like, nobody turns up and says people should be left behind. Nobody turns up and says we want to pollute the planet. You know, nobody says, you know, we want, you know, profit at all costs. But often that's what we have. So what's the missing, like what's the action? What's the missing action that your sector, the people you're representing, can think about? Like what more could we do? So John, let's start with you. Like from your perspective, what's the missing piece that would actually create the change that we're all looking for?
Well, then the first question is, you know, who am I representing? And in a way, I suppose that robot in the cartoon, I've often felt that I'm trying, in particularly working with business and financial markets and so on, to bring the future into the discussion today. So what I would like to do is to break the frame where the negotiations around the sort of socioeconomic contract starts to bring future generations in formally into the process, because I think we are facing a pan-generational challenge here, and people are, I talked about Acciona and the need to bring younger people into decision making, but we can't simply dump this challenge and all those opportunities into the laps of younger people. Older people of all ages have got to be involved. And one of the things I really worry about at the moment is I think older people tend to become more conservative, small c, as they age. And we need a period of reasonable radical innovation now and real shifts in investment. And older people won't necessarily support that unless we help them to do that. And I think, so it is pan-generational. We've got to bring every generation into the process. And maybe the unions have a very strong role to play in that. You may already be doing that. And if so, I'd love to know more about it. Back to you.
Isabel, then that's a good cue to go to you.
Thank you. Yeah, to take the youth on board is a good avenue. Is the one we have already identified since a long time, working on that. Even with an issue of a proposal for a quota inside the training movement. So I think this is learning from the discussions on gender and on vulnerable group. What we need to do from our side is to invest in other issues than the social ones, where we are parked and where people do not see us acting in other fields. Finance has been mentioned. Competition is another one. Trade has been mentioned too. I think this is where we are, and we should be much more active than before, because we are here also speaking for relaying the voice of workers inside and outside the European Union, inside the business operation and the supply chain, and with the subcontractors. And this is something that we do in coordination with our colleagues from the European Trading Federations, but also from the international level. And this is something that we are experiencing with the European institutions, that they are not used to speak with us. And this is something that we are working on, and we should improve definitely from our side, but also to be understood as key players and here also are part of the solution for a sustainable future.
Therese.
I think that to answer your question of what is missing, given the common ground that exists on the big picture that you have referred to, I think what is missing is probably the recognition that once a policy has been defined, once a law has been written and adopted, once a collective agreement has been negotiated, it's only the start. Even so, it is difficult enough to arrive to succeed in these endeavors. It's even more difficult to make sure that the results of the three actions I just mentioned actually start having and concrete effects on the ground and bring people, every person, every employer bring every employer with us in this transformation effort. We have to acknowledge that beyond the first steps of defining policies, we need to put much more energy into actually allowing and creating the conditions for their proper implementation. And I think that is what is missing very often. We tend to prefer to build new bridges, if you want, rather than transforming and improving existing bridges once they have been, and maintaining them once they have been produced. So it's a bit the run after new announcement rather than doing the deep, serious, less sexy work on the ground, which will follow on the big policy decisions that are being announced in the news.
Well, I only have 1 minute to try and wrap all that up, but I'm somewhat relieved in that I don't need to do it in a detailed way, because we're about to be joined by Jackie Davis, who's our theme weaver for the conference. And Jackie, as you know, manages to identify all of the themes and identifies for us what the key messages are. But just if I can just set out what I think the top three messages for me coming out of this are. The first one is that it's quite clear the pushback against we say progressive ideas in Europe is well understood by the Commission. Frans Timmermans was very clear in his understanding about that, and also about the need to join up forces to be able to counteract the negative backlash that we're beginning to see. We're also very clear that there are no low-skilled jobs in our economy. That cleaners, carers, this is not low-skilled work. This is essential work, and essential work has to be recognised, respected, and properly paid. And there is a problem in that so many of these workers are minimum wage workers, and minimum wage not being enough to put food on the table at the end of the week. We also know that the Commission is trying to do something about that in bringing forward a directive. We know that there's lots of complications in the need for that directive to make sure that there's no negative impact coming out of that. But at the same time, it is regrettable the lack of joined up support across the different sectors, from employers to NGOs and from governments, into if we're going to make it believable that nobody should be left behind, we need to make very clear about just how bad things can get for people, and that there's a threshold of decency below which nobody should fall in the European Union. If they don't have a job, or if they have a job, that there needs to be a threshold of decency to take some of the fear out of the way in which workers are thinking about the future. So if you like, there is a need for us to lead our communities, to lead the discussion in our communities in a way that allows, when these ideas come forward into the reality, that they're no longer just rhetoric and said at conferences, that there is, we say, some mobilization to bring our different constituents to the table in a way that comes to solutions. And that certainly, if we're going to say that nobody's going to be left behind, we need that directive on minimum wages needs to be able to guarantee a threshold below which nobody will fall if they're when they're working. But more importantly, what we also need to look at is fair rules for the single market. And the fair rules for the single market need to be as much about green as they need to be about social, as they need to be about the ways in which companies are given a secure environment in which they can operate. So as a company, there's a lot of rules in the single market that guarantee, you know, if I turn up and I do business in place X, here's how my company is going to be secure there. There's less security for workers. And that also needs to be part of the fair rules that are being embedded within the single market. And I think central to that is this major summit that's going to happen in Porto. And the major summit that's going to happen in Porto needs to speak to the insecurity of working people. They need to be able to understand that Europe does indeed understand what's going on for them, understands the fear and security that's surrounding them, whether it's in terms of their health, whether it's in terms of their job, whether it's in terms of the future for their families or the future for their own careers. That needs to be clearly explained. But more importantly, and this is what this session was about, and I'm going to hand over now to Jackie, is that what we need to know is that there are solutions that are going to be delivered within a reasonable timeline, and we're still struggling with that question. We're still struggling with the question of how do we manage to bring in the European Union all of the member states together in a way that actually results in good outcomes, and that the meetings support, as we're all saying, nobody being left behind, and that there is a just transition, and that begins to look in practice at the end of the working week and within families and communities, that they can see that isn't just a promise, but it is a reality. But I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts, for being here. I want to thank everybody who's stayed with us online. I'm going to hand over right now to Jackie. You won't see me again. The next person who's going to be sitting here is our General Secretary, Luca. So thanks to all of you, for friends and colleagues, and for all of you. Have a great weekend. So Jackie, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Esther. I'm not going to try, ladies and gentlemen, to do justice to the 3 days of intense and very rich discussions that you've been having. It's impossible to do it in 5 minutes, but what I am going to try and do is pull some of the strands together and highlight a few key points, some red threads, if you like, that have run their way through all of the discussion. So first, coming back to the fundamental question at the heart of our debate, why we need a new socio-ecological contract, speakers at this conference all agreed that the old ruled book is at best outdated, with rules that don't reflect the new realities, as Ursula von der Leyen herself acknowledged in the opening session, or at worst, as Sharon Barrow put it, broken. That we need this new paradigm for our economic model that Luca Vicentini and many others spoke about. We need to move from one based on growth and GDP measurement to a well-being economy, to a new relationship between the state and the markets, between the state and society. And it's urgent. The challenges we face are so immense that, as we were reminded by Isabel Sherman in this last session, there can be no return to business as usual or old norms once the COVID crisis is over. So I think over the 3 days, we have answered the question Philippe Pochet posed at the beginning. Yes, this really is a turning point, and we need to change course now. As Frans Timmermans and many other speakers have said, at what Frans Timmermans called just now the defining moment for our generation. Not just because of the scale of and urgency of the challenges we face, but also because COVID has provided us with perhaps a unique moment of opportunity to act by underlining the weaknesses of governments and the public sector, challenging some of those dogmas of the traditional economic model, highlighting the importance of the role of the state. So, if this is a unique moment, what direction do we need to move in? What should the reset, if you like, include? I'll mention just a few points that have come through time and again. I think for me, very strikingly, our discussions have underlined just how interconnected the three sides of the sustainability and well-being equation are: the economic, the social and the environmental, a message that was very much reinforced in the panel discussions that we had this morning on beyond GDP and well-being, on biodiversity, on trade and on transport. Just two short quotes, one which has been repeated time and time again at this conference that illustrate this point. There are no jobs on a dead planet. And so many others have reminded us, if the transition is not fair, it will fail. The EU talks a lot now about the importance of a just transition, but we heard a number of warnings that it remains peripheral rather than at the centre of the debate where it needs to be. And it's vital now to move from words on paper to concrete actions and to make sure that politicians actually live up to those commitments. One example, we heard a suggestion that Eurozone governance rules, the so-called Stability and Growth Pact, should be renamed. It should be called now the Sustainability and Wellbeing Pact. Urgent action is needed, particularly within this, to tackle growing inequalities, which have been exacerbated by the pandemic, with a focus not just on minimums, but on upward convergence. And coming back to a point that was discussed a lot yesterday and again came up specifically in one panel, but right across the board, time to wage that battle over the reduction in working hours, the great taboo as it was called, for the sake of our work-life balance, to tackle unemployment and address the climate crisis. Again, those interconnections coming in. Also need to reconsider how we value jobs as a society. The focus on labour productivity and economic growth has meant that as a society, we don't attach the importance that we should to essential and key workers, again, underlined by the COVID crisis. And the new contract needs to address those impacts of digitalization to realize the benefits it can bring and mitigate some of those downsides, most particularly for platform workers. So how do we Finally, translate the new contract into concrete action. All of this needs to be backed up by a massive programme of investment to deliver the socio-ecological transition. And as we were reminded again in the last session, with positive conditionalities attached to it, not the negative ones, not the austerity of the last crisis. And again, we've come back to the point about the indicators to measure progress going beyond GDP and indeed to take account of all these interconnections, a topic of a panel this morning, that compass that was spoken about to ensure that once the course has been set, we actually do stay on it. And above all, none of this can happen without social dialogue and without the trade union movement. For Frans Timmermans said, and I quote, "We can only succeed if trade unions are seen as an integral part of decision-making, policy shaping and execution." And the Commission President acknowledged in her opening session, good policies that will stand the test of time can only be built through dialogue, and that collective bargaining has a crucial role to play. We heard time and again how important it is for workers and for communities to play an active role in this debate and have a real say in how the transition to a green society is delivered. And trade unions finally also need to consider how, as we heard in this session, how to build those alliances, those coalitions, to join forces with others, and also to look at itself and to consider whether the tools it has for effecting change are adequate to meet the challenges we've been discussing or need revisiting, in order to contribute to the maximum to shaping that debate and generating wide support for a just transition at this moment of opportunity for real change. That's all from me. I'd just like to finish by thanking the rapporteurs who briefed me very fast and magnificently on the parallel sessions, and apologies to all of you for the many points that I couldn't include due to time constraints. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to Philippe Pochet and Luca Vicentini for concluding remarks.